Welcome to The Stumbling Spirit, contemplations on the path of resilience. Whether you realize it or not, you are resilient. It's your birthright. As you take in your next breath, know this truth. It's not only about your capacity to overcome difficult situations, but it's about your courage to do the necessary work to heal, learn, grow, and move forward. What you gain is invaluable wisdom. And it's through these hard stumbles in life that we often discover a new purpose that aligns with our spirit. My name is Fabio da Silva Fernandez, Reiki Master, Mindfulness Coach, and Mystical Explorer. Join me weekly as the Stumbling Spirit podcast highlights the lives of extraordinary people like you, sharing transformative stories and beneficial practices of resilience to guide you on your wellness journey. Children's rights NGO Humanium says, quote, "A lack of representation in media can lead to negative psychological outcomes for those with identities that are underrepresented or negatively portrayed," unquote. Helping to improve representation in children's literature is Canadian author Debra Williams with her trailblazing and beautifully illustrated book, Church Hat. Inspired by her family, Church Hat is about a Black boy who admires his mother and her fashion sense, and one day gets caught wearing her colorful crown reserved for Sunday service. This is a heartwarming story of self-expression, identity, diversity, acceptance, but above all, the loving bond between a parent and child. Here to talk about her storybook is writer, filmmaker, empowerment coach, and friend, Debra Williams. Hi, Debra.
Hi.
Welcome to the show. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge Janine Carrington, who did the wonderfully colorful and vibrant illustrations in your book. Why is this specific story important for you to tell?
This story for me is a tribute to two people who really helped to shape me as a person, and that was my mother and her mother, my maternal grandmother. This came from me thinking about them both during the isolation of the pandemic. You know, the irony was that I had lost my mother the year before and my grandmother a couple of years before then. And I remember thinking, gosh, this would be a really great experience, not knowing how long our safe at home status would last. I say safe at home, not stuck at home, because I consider it to have been a privilege that I was someone who could continue working from home. That, you know, we could all have been in one house together. And I really missed them. It was like I missed the opportunity to spend a lot of time with them. And as I thought about them and as I was working through this residual grief of thinking of the what ifs if we had been together, I decided that I was going to pay tribute to them somehow. And one of the projects that I took on with the extra time that we had during the first parts of the pandemic was going through old family photos and really looking at which ones to keep and which ones to archive in good old-fashioned albums, which ones to image and share with others. And I came across this fantastic picture of my mother and grandmother wearing these enormous hats at some wedding, some function, where they were with the hats and the gloves and the bag and the cocktail dress. I thought, oh my goodness, they look amazing. And just through thinking about who they were as people who always had an open door for others and were always accepting of others in the family and having people come in and out of my grandmother's house all the time. The church hat concept came to my mind because I'm from a Caribbean household where it's very binary. The Caribbean culture can be extremely conservative when it comes to, you know, gender preference. And, you know, there are dance hall songs that are very, you know, offensive when it comes to the idea of anyone having a non-binary lifestyle. I write all the time. I'm always writing in journals and I do free writing. And I just remember writing down that it would be great to tell the story of acceptance and love in a home that may have seemed unlikely. I didn't really understand how unlikely it was that members of my immediate and extended family are in the gay and lesbian and LGBTQ community, and that they were a part of everything in our family. They weren't ostracized. Their lifestyle wasn't muted. They weren't made to feel othered until I was around other families or in other Caribbean environments where you really heard the hostility towards that. And so I thought this is where I can really show how wonderful it was to grow up in a home led by matriarchs who said, generational trauma is going to end here. My grandmother in her 60s walked my uncle down the aisle to marry his husband and told everyone, I have 8 children and all of them are my children and not one of them is going to be refused. And she literally took names of people who didn't come to his wedding because, they showed their opposition by not showing up. And so it was important for me to show that there are ways of doing things. We can end generational trauma in one lifetime. We can say, we are family. You can be in a child's place, but show who you are, question. I remember talking with my uncle about him, never really having to hide who he was, but knowing other people who did. And so I think it's around a very young age, like 6 or 7, where someone who feels as if, they may have a different way of doing things or liking things or orientation starts to understand whether they can talk about it or not. And my uncle said he was always able to be himself around my grandmother and was always protected in the family. So this was the scenario I envisioned to sort of pay tribute to my understanding of how unique and normal we are as a family, that it should be normal that a young person can say, I have something to tell you, and I'm really questioning something, and I want to know if I can be myself, and have the adult they trust say, yes, we love you. And I'll tell you more about the whole concept of the hierarchy there, because my mother and my grandmother, they were never my friends. In the Caribbean household, there's a hierarchy between children and their parents and their grandparents. But that didn't stop us from being honest and open with one another. And I really wanted to show that in this, and that love always wins.
Do you think that in Caribbean households that heterosexism is more prevalent? Just the idea that what is more accepted is sort of heteronormative
Oh, yes,
ways of
yes.
living in the world.
Yes, absolutely. It is definitely a prevalent message that there's boys and girls. That's it.
Why do you think in your family, I guess every family is different, but just to say,
Mhm.
what is it about your family or about Mama Ivy and
Mm.
your mom Yvonne that made them so accepting of people regardless of their sexual orientation?
I never had a chance to really ask them outright. It was just something I observed. And maybe seeing how ugly it was in others was something that my grandmother never wanted to have. She was a very independent thinker, my grandma, in a very subtle way. She grew up in a time where there were definitely rules around who women were and what women did. But she had rebellious kids. Like my mother was married, didn't like who she was married to, and got, clutched the pearls, a divorce, and then cut her hair and went off and went to work on the north coast of Jamaica, which is where we grew up, and sort of like left the family and said, I want to do my own thing. And there seems to be a vein throughout my whole family where people work sort of trailblazers. And I know that doesn't sound like much now to say that you would cut your hair and wear a man's shirt and go to work someplace else out of the household and leave town and go to the other side of the island. But that was a big deal back then. And she was never told, don't come home. She was just told, when you're ready to tell us what's going on, let us know. It just seemed to me my grandmother had 8 children and she knew that they were all very different. And she loved the qualities of all of them, including my uncle, her youngest son, who was the young boy in the book, and just never ever thought about not seeing them as a cohesive group of people that she gave birth to and loved and nurtured, and they were to get her undivided attention and her support.
I could really relate to the story in the sense that when I was a kid, I loved wearing my mother's shoes. And I would wear, I don't know if you remember them, they're those cork platform high heeled slip on shoes. And I would put them on and I'd walk around the house and I'd hear the backs of the shoes slap up against my heels. And I really did look up to my mom. There's a lot about that in the story around this boy that idolizes his mom, right?
Yes, there is. And that first experience that someone has where they step outside of, well, they don't know. They don't know they're stepping outside of a norm when they're doing that. I don't know if when you did that, you thought you were doing something that you needed to hide or you needed to keep a secret. But in the innocence of doing that, if the answer is judgment, if the answer is stigma, if the answer is even sometimes, violence, where a child gets, that first beating, where they remember, don't do that again, that's when you start to hide, and that's when you start to code switch and mask and not be your authentic self. If I can share with you, I showed the book to a friend of mine who's gay, and he actually started crying, and he said, "This is exactly what happened to me." He said, I should have written this book. And I said, first of all, why you didn't write this book is because what happened was so traumatic, because your family didn't support you. And he said, I was 5, and I had a little sister, and I put on my mother's shoes and her hat and her shawl, and I picked up my little sister like I was the mom, and I hugged her to me, and I walked around, and I got the beating of my life. And, I never did that again. And he hid his sexual orientation to his family and left as soon as he could. And I said, and that's why you didn't write the story, because it was a horrible experience. If someone had just said, "What are you thinking about? What are you doing? Explain to me what you're questioning. What's going on?" Totally different interaction, totally different level of a feeling of belonging and trust. I hope that's not the case anymore. But for a majority of people I spoke to, the reaction is quite emotional and triggering, and brings back an incident that wasn't pleasant. So I wanted this book and this story to normalize that this is the way it should be. And I am not an agenda person. I am not someone who's trying to tell people how to raise their kids or how to think. I'm just saying that in the child's place that I was in my mother's home, in my grandmother's home, I knew that I could trust them with my thoughts, and trust them to guide me, and trust them to keep me safe.
And even if it isn't that extreme, I think that growing up in the 70s and 80s, which I did, there was a lot of mixed messaging. But I think that it was a product of the times as well. Not to say that we're not dealing with issues today. We definitely are. We're seeing it. But I think that in that period of time, I think that there was less of a language around expressing diversity, sexual diversity, gender diversity.
Absolutely. And I don't think a lot of people who are raising children necessarily have the tools to deal with a situation like this. And I really see the book as a bit of a tool. My stealth is that it's really for the people who are reading it to the child more than it is for the child themselves. It's really a story about how to just take a breath and understand that in that moment, someone has a choice to make about how it is they portray the way that they can relate to someone who may be saying something they don't understand, or they didn't expect, or they need to continue a conversation in a safer environment. And I never say safety is never ultimate. There's always elements of risk and safety. That's why I tend to say safer. And just like you're saying, you may have the feeling that society has moved on and we're post this or post that. But individual interactions are what really shape how someone can react to their own situation and their level of trust about who they can be in their authentic skin. And it is an extraordinary person who can be rejected or be judged or feel as if they're looked down on, and continue to exhibit that same behavior because it's uncomfortable, especially if you're 6 or 7 or 8 years old and you're around the adults that you trust and you idolize and you want to be like them. The minute there's any sense of rejection, it's very daunting. When I've gone to classrooms with the book, the only thing that the kids want to know is, and I have this hat that I put together, this kind of like large hat that's like a big, spring hat, and I let kids know if they want, they can wear it. The only question I ever get is, some of the times I get the question, "What's a church?" Because a lot of children are growing up entirely outside of any sort of religious setting. And that one is always a surprise to me, where someone literally says, "What's a church?" And the other question is, "Can we wear the hat and take a picture in the hat?" But seldom do you get any sort of rejection around, "Oh, it's a he and he shouldn't be doing this." It's just, he's just trying on a hat. For all I know, the young boy who is in this book wears the hat, and later on, it doesn't lead to anything. I don't know. It's not an indication really of anything. It's
Exactly.
just a question.
I love that about your story. We don't really know whether he is gay or trans, or whether he just likes trying on women's clothes or questioning. We don't have a sense of that. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. It just does not matter. And it's so beautiful to see those kids in your classroom that you were in, the innocence to just, I just want to try on the hat.
Exactly. I go to Metropolitan Community Church, and there's a children's church as well, and I've gone to take this book and read during service. And it's the same thing. Everybody's like, well, can we get crafts and make a hat? Oh, they're just like all about the hat. They don't really have any angst about the fact that somebody asked a question and it was, it's just like, oh, all right, let's make hats. I want to wear my hat to church next week. And I really hope that's conveyed in the idea that the way that the book wraps up is he gets to design his own hat, and that's the point. Design your own hat.
Yeah. Before we get there, though, I do want to sort of highlight some places within the book. In your story, the boy sees his mom as a queen because you refer to the hat as a crown, or he sees them as her crowns. And one day he decides to try on a new hat when she isn't home. And then when he tries it on, she catches him red-handed and not only wearing the hat, but wearing a scarf, hand on hip. One of my favorite lines comes next. Would you mind reading page 15?
I froze in guilt and panic, not knowing what to do. It meant the world when Mama said, you know that I love you.
It's so beautiful. It's so
Thank you.
beautiful because it speaks to what you're talking about, right? Because the reaction could be very threatening, right? From a parent, right? If they react in a way that puts a child in a place of fear, shame, guilt, embarrassment, all of that. And in other households, the outcome could be far worse. To what extent is this book teaching parents to be more compassionate?
I think that that is the stealth agenda, that as someone is reading this, that first thing you say and there's a power dynamic here. I have a child who is in their parents' room doing something that isn't bad, but it's kind of like the thought is this really isn't sort of allowed. And the way that you use that power dynamic to diffuse the situation and create an environment where the person who feels unempowered feels safer is so important. It is so important to know how your child sees you. You're this big adult person who has money and goes out and makes decisions and drives and puts food on the table and, is important. And so being gentle and being empathetic and being patient is such a superpower.
100%. I was looking up some stats, and according to the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, the leading cause of homelessness among 2S LGBTQ plus youth is, quote, identity-based family violence resulting from a young person coming out. 2S LGBTQ plus youth make up 20 to 40% of the homeless youth population across North America, end quote. I also got some data from the Trevor Project, and they say that suicide is the second leading cause of death among young people aged 10 to 14, and the third leading cause of death among 15 to 24-year-olds. And that LGBTQ plus young people are at higher risk and are more than 4 times likely to attempt suicide than their peers. What do you make of those stats?
I work in an organization that deals with mental health and community services, and I'm very aware of those statistics. And that just goes to show you the despair that a young person feels when they don't feel as if they belong, if they're in a physically or mentally abusive environment, that they can't be their authentic selves. You can only pretend and code switch so much, feeling unsupported, and not a lot of people can pretend to be someone else until they can leave the house and then walk away. Some people don't, can't make that journey. And I just feel as if the attempt to squash it, pray the gay away, conversion therapy, and all these other ridiculous, it's never worked. It's never worked. Like, this is not something that someone does to make anybody mad. We really need to have some education out there for the adults. It's not the kids that need the education, it's the adults. It's the adults that aren't getting it, the ones that are making the punitive legislation, the ones that are banning books, the ones that are wanting to erase queer history from everyone's understanding that it's not that the person was gay or lesbian or trans. It's the content of their character, what they did. The latest Netflix production of Rustin, the man who organized the March on Washington. Now we've seen Dr. Martin Luther King's March on Washington lauded for 60 years. Never did I ever learn that the person who organized it was a man named Rustin, and he happened to be gay. He was gay, so they wrote him out of history. I remember seeing that at the Toronto International Film Festival and just thinking, oh my goodness, there's so many stories out there that we haven't been allowed to see. Representation really matters. And it was very important to me that this book presents this multifaceted representation, that it was a little Black boy in a Caribbean household who's just questioning. And we don't know what the answer is yet. Can we just ask a question in peace and be able to feel safer around the adults that we trust? And that allows someone to just drop their shoulders and realize that they can continue to be trusting and that the people around them aren't going to judge and reject them. And I want that positive mental health and that ending generational trauma message just be an underlying goal, to not put a child in the position of having to make the decision about whether they can take it anymore.
Absolutely. What do you make of the backlash against books like yours in the US and also in Canada as well? Like in Toronto, we had a protest not long ago, right? Where parents were protesting curriculum related to us LGBTQ plus issues. So what do you make of all that?
I see ignorance, I see fear, I see a movement around normalization that doesn't really reflect who we are. And I'm not so insulated that I don't have, friends and people around me who may have less progressive points of view than I do. It's not like that. I really go back to the word fear on this. The idea that speaking openly about the contributions of everyone and the validity of everyone has made people feel less than. As if, I always say equity isn't pie. There's enough for everyone. Giving someone else the ability to be themselves does not take away from your ability to be yourself. There's room for everyone's equity. And I think that there's some very sinister, actually, there are people who see power in this. I think it all comes down to people who see the power of disinformation, of misinformation, and of using fear to gain more power. I really do. I think it's as basic as some people just figuring out what the angle is to get more power. At the end of the day, I don't think that people who are happy treat other people like this. It's very simple to me. Someone who's happy isn't looking for someone else to oppress. There's something going on in the messaging that's coming out from certain sources that suggests that people are being wronged or they're being threatened somehow by the success of others, and that if someone else has a foothold in society and is making decisions, somehow that's going to take things away from the global you. And I find it to be rather sinister.
It's also a distraction from the real issues.
100%.
You know what I loved about your book? I mean, there's so many things about it, but there's validation in her son's self-expression and desire to be like his mom. And at the same time, there's boundary setting, right? Because she's saying, don't touch my things, right? So can you do me a favor and read pages 23 and 24?
She smiled and held her hat in hand. How about a compromise? We'll go together to the store and buy one customized. You pick the color and the shape and a new outfit too, while we keep talking honestly about what you're going through.
It's such a great way to build safety and trust. What else can you share about the significance of this part of the story?
Well, to me, and this is what actually saw my mom and grandma do this, not dwell in the thing. It brings him back into his own ownership of what's happening, rather than only having a conversation about what he may be questioning. Realize that there is a way for another kind of expression around it. Obviously, he wants to wear hats, but it is not allowed for you to touch another person's hat in Caribbean culture and church culture. The hat, and by the way, it is called crowns. in Black communities. And there's three kinds of crowns. There's big, bigger, and why'd you have to sit in front of me?
That's funny.
So there's so much style, whether someone has the fascinator that's in front of their hair, or someone comes in with just a whole story on top of their head, or whether someone likes the tall hats or stiff hats or the ones that hug the back of their head. Like there's so much personality in it. And Black women in particular in Black communities call their hats crowns. And they have their hat boxes, and you don't put them on the floor, and they don't sit in cardboard, just any box. They have hat boxes that come with them. It's a whole thing. That is why I wanted to include this cultural awareness of, yes, you're going to be able to wear hats, but they're going to be your hats. And there's that child's place that I always maintained until the day my mother passed away. I was always her daughter. I was never a peer. And I wanted to show that as a part of Caribbean culture as well, that she understands that he wants to have his own fashion and his own style that may, reflect hers, but he was going to do it his way and then put her hat back in the closets.
I want to go back to something you said earlier, and that's about how we don't really know what the boy's sexuality or gender expression is. And I think it also speaks to the fluidity of identity and how identity changes our entire life in accordance to how we know ourselves. The more we learn about ourselves, the more our identity changes. And so I really liked that aspect of the book.
Thank you. Again, it was never supposed to be specifically any agenda about saying someone was or was not anything, but exactly what you're saying. You're finding your way. You're a little person running around, seeing how the adults do things, and you're just trying stuff on. And I find both my nephews, they just idolize their mothers because you spend a lot of time around mom. First, I always think that young boys in a two-parent household that happens to be a father and a mother kind of cling to mom until a certain age, and then they start hanging out with dad more. It just sort of happens that way. And so to me, this is one of the aspects of being close to your mom's knee, just being a mama's boy, is that you want to be like her, not really understanding anything about gender, just understanding what it's like to idolize someone and want to be like them. And it could very well be in another house that someone, dresses up with dad's shoes, but that's not met with the same reaction. And this to me was about what happens when someone innocently and feeling in their feelings and their identity at the time steps out of that definition, and what happens when they are greeted with the realization that thinking differently is okay or not okay. And that to me was really the message. And again, go back to that power dynamic, that remember when you're the adult and you're around a child, a young adult, that power dynamic is always something that's very scary to them. And your ability to show empathy and compassion, patience and understanding, and go into every single discussion with love always wins is where the win happens. That's where the win is that love always wins.
One of the things I like about what RuPaul says is that everything we put on is drag. No matter what we put on, it's all drag. And the church hat in your book is a form of drag, a drag for the mom, but also a drag for the son. What is the personal significance of the church hat for you?
It's just something that is about culture. And when I say culture, I mean behavior. There's a formality to it. There's an intentionality behind getting dressed for church. There's a sign of respect. There's an individuality that's expressed. Like I was saying, people have their styles of hats that they wear, and it really shows who they are in their outer dress. There's such a recognition in Black communities that I grew up in, both Caribbean and in the United States and in Canada, where you find yourself in an environment where people get dressed for church, that there's a sense of pride. I always think about the days when a lot of people of color and Black people were not allowed to be in professional roles. Most of the roles they were in were roles that required a uniform. And so if you're wearing a porter's uniform or, some sort of uniform that puts you in service to others, the only day that you really get to express yourself is on Sunday when you go to church. And so this idea of coming out with your Sunday best and showing yourself outside of the constriction of that uniform, that sameness, that uniformity, to be your own person at church, to express yourself. It's embedded in a lot of Black communities and the culture of Black communities to really show your expression of who you are through your clothing. And I really think that that's a legacy of a time when your day to day was suppressed by what you had to wear in order to go to work.
That's an amazing point. The church as an institution is a powerful metaphor in your book as well, too, right? Because on the one hand, it's a space of acceptance, but it's not always welcoming. And there's a sense of rebelliousness, too, in that the mom helps her son pick out church hats so that he could wear them to church, right?
Correct. And one of the things I always, and I didn't put it in the book because I didn't want it to take another message other than the one that I was thinking about. But, you know, if Black Lives Matter, then all Black Lives Matter. And I'll go back to the Rustin story. Here's a civil rights organizer that's written out of the history of organizing one of the most momentous civil rights marches ever because of his sexual orientation. That's just the height of bad irony. What is it about someone being a part of the LGBTQ plus community that is so scary to people? What is it? You know, and a lot of it comes from religious teachings. Well, it comes from the way religious teachings are conveyed. And I go back to that power. I go back to the idea of the power dynamic that some religious organizations have over this narrative about what's wrong and what's right, and how to interfere with and become obsessed with what people do in their private lives. When really, and this is why I go to MCC Toronto, this is why that became my church home. I didn't go to church for a long time until I found that church home. This is why I go there, because they lead with love. It's a church for everyone. It has a Christian undertone. That's the way the services are conducted. But come because you found that the faith that you were brought up in is too much about who can't be a part of it, who doesn't belong, who isn't doing the right thing. A lot of people are sort of like, you know, religious expats from the religion they came from to say, I want to have a spiritual life. I want to be in a community of service. I want to donate to an organization that's helping newcomers and helping and taking care of the sick. But I don't want to do it if they're going to quote some section of whatever book we're reading says that these people are going to hell. I don't want to do that. There's a lot going on in the church hat metaphor. There is a lot going on. The idea that the answer isn't that he wears a hat outside of church that is like hers, but at church has to be like his father's. This was reflected in the short animated film. To visualize this a little better, he can be an individual and is an individual and can be supported as an individual. And if you are secure in yourself, then that child's expression should not threaten you.
Absolutely. I was curious about something. You wrote this book in the first person. Did you make a conscious decision not to name the boy?
I did. I wanted it to be that anyone who read it could see themselves. I wanted it to be sort of universal, especially if it was in an audiobook. If someone's reading this book with the lights down because it's time to go to bed, and they're put in a situation where they feel scared, and then because of the way the adults handle the situation, they feel safer. I think that's a universal message that I want anyone reading it as the adult who can provide that safety, and the child listening to it can say, oh, this is the kind of scenario where I felt, no, not even in this scenario, but this is how I want to feel if I want to tell my parent this. They can absorb that information in their own situation and not have a name associated with it. It was intentional. Yes, it was.
It is really about the relationship between the mother and son, isn't it?
Yes. And it's because I was just writing it based on what I know and what I observed with these two extraordinary women who I didn't realize were that extraordinary until I started talking with other people and were in other households and realized, wow, my mom and grandma are just two really amazing people. And I've learned so much from them. And I so want to be more like them every day.
What is it about the bond between a mother and son?
You know, I think about my mom and my brother, and my sister and her son. And there's something about it it's not a mirror, it's not someone looking at themselves younger. It's someone really looking at someone that they want to be the best person that can maybe take the legacy of maybe this an idea of legacy. You know, how does that woman send a man out into the world to be the best person he can be? And I have noticed that as well. And being child free, I really can't explain it. But I know what you mean. There's a really special bond between a mother and son. And when I saw my grandmother with all her kids and how protective she was to my uncle, and he didn't even realize it, because I've had this discussion with him where he said, well, I never really had to, hide myself. And I said, Uncle John, that's extraordinary. You don't really understand how lucky you were, how fortunate you were that grandma would like walk you down the aisle at a time when some people wouldn't come to your wedding. She was just fierce for you. And you were always so insulated and so protected and safe that you don't really understand it. But I'm glad it's there. I'm glad there's this bond there because kids always need their parents no matter what. Even as adults, I miss them now. I miss my mom and grandma, my parents, my dad now. I wish they were here, but that's not the way the world works.
You mentioned earlier that your roots are in the Caribbean, but you also lived in the US, right? So, how does the US experience influence the story?
Living in the US I look back on it as some of the most interesting experiences because, it's called the United States, but depending on where you live in the United States, the points of view can be really different. And I would just draw the contrast between cities and rural parts of any state. Most of the time I was in Texas, in Houston or Austin. And these are two places, there's a joke that once you leave Austin, you're back in Texas again. I was always very careful to be aware of where I was when I was in the States. And it's not something that I was as aware that I was doing until I moved to Canada, when I moved back to Canada. I was born and raised in Jamaica until I was 12. We came to Canada for 3 years. We went to the States for what was supposed to be a temporary situation where my father was working in Texas. He passed away there, and I ended up staying there for 22 years. My brother was born there, and then I moved back here in 2001. And it's kind of like you have to be away from it to see it, right? Because I was in a group of people that were friends who were, of course, very like-minded and college educated and professionally employed. And you surround yourselves with people who have very similar points of view, even though sometimes they may be I'm more progressive or they're more conservative on something. It was friendly. And it wasn't until I moved back to Canada and was able to have this sort of rear view look at the States and say, wow, there was a lot going on there that I tolerated, that I was a part of, that I don't know how I would deal with those experiences now. I feel as if I learned so much from living there. I grew there as an adult, as a person. And I've been back in Canada now for almost as many years, for 20 something years. And the contrast is that I feel much more comfortable writing a book like this here than I would have felt if I was still there. I don't know if I would have written this book if I was there because of what's happening, because of how restrictive and how extreme reactions to differences of opinions are. It's not safe. You have to know where you are and always have your head on a swivel just to have a difference of opinion. I feel much more comfortable living in Canada and being someone who can create content like this.
But it's interesting because you're also inspired by your experience in the US to write this book.
You're right about that. I am. It is part of the fuel to get a message out there in a way that I think is easy to digest. It's really just a short story about an experience that a young child has and how it has the audacity of a happy ending.
I'm just curious about, because we're talking about identity, how do you see yourself?
I really now kind of see myself as someone with lots of experience who can be a light worker. I'm very interested in being part of the solution. I don't want to do identity politics and necessarily be in the right on anything. I really want to be someone who can be part of the kinds of conversations that lead to people being able to hear each other. And even if they don't agree, just acknowledge that that's okay, that people can have differences of opinions that are informed by experiences, that are informed by what they read, informed by the experiences of others whom they know. And it's not about being right or wrong. Always put human rights first. It's all about human rights and solidarity. I am in solidarity. My solidarity is wrapped up in someone else's solidarity. My ability to be a person who's comfortable with my freedom of speech is wrapped up in someone else's ability to have freedom of speech. And so I want to be able to actively listen to someone else's point of view and appreciate that just because they disagree with me, that doesn't mean that they're wrong or an idiot or I never speak to them again, but just try to unpack that. How does somebody come to this point of view? Do I have it right? It makes you examine yourself when you hear someone who you think or assume would be right alongside with the way you think, have a different point of view. Let's stop a second and listen to what they have to say.
It's funny because I truly believe that most people have far more things in common than they don't. And, there's a friend of mine who is more on the conservative side of the spectrum, and I'm more on the liberal side of the spectrum. But when we get together, we laugh so hard because we're able to be in the space and not take ourselves so seriously. And I think that sometimes we can take ourselves too seriously. It's interesting, right? Because on the one hand, you have that. But then on the other hand, there are situations where there are hard lines in the sense that I don't know how I would be able to negotiate with someone who's homophobic, for example, or transphobic. The only thing that I could do is be as compassionate as possible to those people that need compassion. But to someone who has an ideology that is about repression and marginalization, then that's where it becomes really challenging.
Agreed. And it's interesting when you have known someone, and I've been in a situation recently where I thought I knew someone, and then a conversation came up and they said something that was really offensive about another group of people. And I thought, oh gosh, I didn't know that that person felt that way. And in a moment there, I thought, well, this is not really the right place for me to sort of take this on. But it was an interesting thing to figure out that up until that point, I thought that this person and I kind of thought about things the same way, except for this thing that they were very different about in a way that if I almost, if I had known that this is the way they thought, we probably wouldn't have become as good friends. So now what do you do? What do you do with that? Again, what you're saying, empathy, tolerance, active listening, and you have to make some decisions sometimes because it's about what you're supporting, even passively what you're supporting. And if you get into a situation where someone else is harmed because of that association, then you have to bear the responsibility for that. I always just want to be honest with other people about who I am and where I am in my thought process so they too can make a decision about whether they would like to spend more time around me and hear my points of view and what I have to say, not to proselytize and try to get people to change their mind. But I also don't want to insulate myself with only like-minded people that only think what I think and only say what I say and yeah, be in the mutual admiration society.
100%, because how can we grow? How can we learn? How can we challenge ourselves? How can we challenge others?
Yes. And in my work as a director of equity, diversity, and inclusion, I bring in speakers into the organization that I work in to bring in points of view from an indigenous point of view, from the point of view of someone who is disabled through not having, full mobility to someone who one of our speakers was profoundly deaf and was talking about functioning in a hearing world and the points of view that people have towards someone who can't hear and don't understand that sign language is also a language and just these other indications of intelligence and things like that and the way people will judge. And again, you have to demystify things that you don't understand, and if you don't demystify them, then you make up stories, and that's where bigotry comes from. It's you're making things up. I think it was my grandmother who may have said that like bigotry and racism is not giving someone the opportunity to have a first impression. I don't know if she heard that from someone else, but the first time I heard someone say that, it was her. And I thought, yeah, that's exactly right. That person thinks they already know you. They already have figured out who you are based on some story or some tale or some statement someone else they trusted told them. And so now they're putting that on you, and you don't have a chance to make a first impression because they think they already know you. There's something so inherently unfair about that.
I'm wondering if you could read from page 25 of your book.
You are my child. I am your mom. We won't always agree, but I will listen and advise. You're always safe with me. You have time to grow and thrive. We don't want you to hide. You should always be yourself. We're always on your side.
And that is the message of the book. It's so beautiful. Do you plan to write a follow-up book?
I do. It's actually written, but I haven't had a chance to talk with Janine about illustrating it yet. But yes, I do. And I actually plan to write three. The book matures as he matures. So the second book will be him as older. It'll be a short story. And it's really about how being himself has challenged the other children around who are also, well, one in particular who's a little taken aback that his family is allowing him to be himself, and how he is just a quiet influence on the ability for others to have challenging conversations.
That's a great idea, actually, to create an arc
Mhm.
to this story where he's a child and now he's growing into a young adult,
Young adult, yeah.
and you are writing from that perspective to that audience. I think that's brilliant. So earlier you talked about a project, and I'm wondering whether you could speak to the film that you're creating right now.
So as you know, I'm a big film festival fan. I've been going to the Toronto International Film Festival for over 20 years. Before that, I used to go to the South by Southwest Film Festival in Austin. And I know a lot of filmmakers, and one in particular, we always used to go to Midnight Madness and see the horror movies. And sometimes we'd overlap and see movies during the day, but Midnight Madness was our thing. There's a group of us. And his name is Eric Cotton, and he's with the Baltimore Filmmakers Collective. And he's done many short documentaries and films. And he bought the book. And so last year, no, it was the year before, when we were just back in person at the film festival, we were just sort of sitting on John Street up from the TIFF building about to go into a screening. And he said, I really like your book. What do you want to do with it? And I said, I would love to turn this into an animated short. And the reason is because when I take the book to things like Word on the Street, or I take it to book fairs, I have had so many children say, are you going to make this into a movie? And kids are all logic, they're not trying to make me feel better. They're just, and I think, well, kids are saying, are you going to make this into a movie? Then I should pursue that. So he asked me what I envisioned. I said, just a short, old style animation, not some AI generated sort of like look that isn't natural. I'd love to find someone who can really animate this in the way a child thinks. And he said, I'm in. I'll do it. And we developed a partnership. And so he knows the creatives, and he put me in touch with an amazing animator named Michal O'Donnell. And we're off to the races. We're a team that signed a agreement to work together. Currently, I am working with the SAG-AFTRA union to speak to the person who will be the voice of the mother. Very excited. I wish I could tell you who it is. It's burning a hole in my head to not be able to tell you because we don't have a signed agreement, but it's someone everyone knows who was interested in the project. We still haven't found the voice of the young boy yet, but we will shortly. It's going to be 7 minutes, which is about right for the pace of the book. And I'm in new territory, but it's very satisfying to pursue this all the way and really nurture these creative juices I have that I'm realizing are very valid and will represent this work in a different way.
Congratulations. I'm so excited about it. I can't wait to watch it.
Thank you.
What does resilience mean to you?
I'm aware of the clinical definition of resilience, almost like the ability to bounce back and, recover. For me, personal resilience has really to do with reflection. It has to do with really looking at the scars that come from experiences that some of them are actually joyful scars. I call them joyful scars because I can look at them and say, I understand my part in this thing or event that happened. And not only that it happened, but how I recovered from it. And that the worst thing that can happen to you is nothing. And so every experience is supposed to make you learn and grow. And so to me, resilience really has a lot to do with being honest about what you made happen versus what happened to you. How can you make things happen? Is it a will problem or is it a skill problem? Is it that you won't do it or you don't know how to do it? And it's never permanent. You can always make the change. You have to make up your mind about what you're willing to do differently to be who you want to be and get what you want out of life. And to me, that's sort of like where resilience comes in. The endurance to stick with something, especially when you've made a promise to yourself.
What are your practices of resilience?
Journaling is very important to me because writing is very reflective for me. I have the good fortune of having close friends that I will get honest feedback from about what's happening. Am I doing the right thing? Am I making the right point? Is this the point of view that makes sense? Am I the person that's the problem, or am I the person that's part of the solution? I really want that vulnerability in my life because I don't think rugged individualism really gets us to a place of feeling whole. I want to be someone who relies on my friends and family and the people that I choose to be around me and choose to want to be around me to be able to be honest about who I am and tell me, this is your reflection and we like it, or this is your reflection and this is the part of you I don't really like. I love you, but this is the part that I don't really like about you, so that I can actively hear that and do better. And the resilience is the honesty around that. If you can't be honest with yourself about who you are, then you're never really going to be truly happy. I like my own company because of that reason. And because I like my own company, I like being around other people more.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Debra. It was such a privilege and pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you.
I am so grateful. I'm so very grateful for this opportunity. Thank you so much for your support, and I will keep you in touch.
For updates on Debra's animated short and to buy her book, visit churchatthefilm.com. You can also email Debra Williams directly, connect@churchatthefilm.com. And on Instagram, follow her handles @StoryToScreen and @MyBestLifeBooks. Thank you for listening to The Stumbling Spirit, Contemplations on the Path of Resilience. This is Fabio da Silva Fernandez. Join me again next week for another episode of transformative stories and beneficial practices to guide you on your wellness journey. If you wish, you can follow and DM me on Instagram @The Stumbling Spirit. Until next time, take a deep breath and another step forward on your path of resilience.